Welcome to The Author Show, where we feature new authors and books, from fiction to self-help and everything in between. You'll find it all at theauthorshow.com. That's theauthorshow.com. And now let the show begin.
Hi, this is The Author Show, and I'm your host, Linda Thompson. Before I introduce our guests, just a quick reminder that selected interviews are available in our iPhone app, which can be downloaded in the App Store, as well as on TV, on the Roku channel and Amazon Fire TV. Our app name on all platforms is The Author Show. Brian never meant to start a war, but when they murdered his parents and enslaved his sister and his sweetheart, they left him no choice. That was the beginning of the synopsis for Archer of the Heathland, Deliverance by author J.W. Elliot. James is here to share more about Brian's story. James, welcome to the Author Show.
Hi, Linda. Thanks. It's great to be here.
James, will you please give us a quick overview of Archer of the Heathland, Deliverance?
Yeah, so this book is about a young man named Brian, who is a trapper living on the edge of the Heathland, which is a vast area occupied by warlike tribes who attack his people. And his sister is kidnapped by them and carried away, and his parents are murdered. And he ends up venturing into the Heathland and accidentally starting a war between the two kingdoms of Dunkeld and Cole. And while he's on this journey in the Heathland, he discovers that his father had a dark secret about his past that he had never revealed. So Brian then finds out that his identity is different than he thought it was. And as he gets caught up in this warfare, it turns out that he's got to make a choice between accepting this identity or remaining a simple archer of the Heathland.
James, I'm under the impression that Deliverance is the first in the Archer of the Heathland series. How many books have you written in this series, and how many more have you planned?
This series actually has 7 full books in it, and it also has a prequel short story that is called Intrigue. Right now, the series is completed, although I am planning some branch-off series to go off of some of the characters and ideas that I explored in the first 7 volumes.
Are you working on a new book or a new series now?
I am, actually. I'm working on a science fiction series right now called The Ark Project. The first book is published, and the second book is in editing at the moment. So I hope to have that out by summer, if everything goes well.
Where did you get the idea for your storyline in Deliverance and your series?
I'm a historian, and I'm also an archer. I build my own bows, and I do a lot of shooting. I used to hunt. I don't do it anymore. You know, I've always been fascinated by the way fiction portrays archery, both in literature and in film. And very often it's kind of done incorrectly. And so people just aren't faithful to the actual technology itself and also to the history surrounding that technology. So I really wanted to write a series that would portray archery as historically accurate as possible inside a fantasy world. And so I was kind of dissatisfied with what I was seeing, so I decided to take my own stab at it, and it evolved over many years. So that was really where I started from. But then I wanted to talk about a young man who struggles with all young people struggle with, and that's identity. Who are we, and what are we going to do with our lives, and how do we control it? So Brian is the character where he gets caught up in events beyond his control and has to decide how to handle it.
Your Archer of the Heathland series is in the teen and young adult fantasy adventure genre. In what period of time does your story occur?
So it's set in a fantasy world that never really existed, but it is set in a kind of a middle to late medieval period. So the technology is probably about 13th century when plate armor is starting to come in, but hasn't really made headway outside of a few rich people who can afford it. So it's kind of in that kind of historical period.
What sets Deliverance and the other books in your series apart from others in the same genre?
I guess it'd be my emphasis really on archery and on the technology and on tactics and making things, even though, again, it's a fantasy world, making them as historically accurate as possible. Because I want people to understand what these technologies are. Some stories give archers far greater skill than is possible with wooden technology. I mean, bows were made out of wood, the arrows were made out of wood. So you can't have the kind of pinpoint action you can have today with a modern compound bow or crossbow. But authors don't often know that. So I think being true to the technology, true to the history, and true to the challenges of that technology, its promises and weaknesses, I think is what kind of sets it apart in that sense.
If you could compare Deliverance with any other, what would that other book be?
So the most common comparison is really Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. And it's similar, but it's different. I would say Archer of the Heathland is a little bit darker than John Flanagan's, and it's a little more intense, a little more fast-paced. But I think that's the one that people would most likely compare it with.
Looking back to your early years, are there any specific books that awed you enough to consider a career as an author?
Yes, there are a lot. Of course, I'm a Tolkien fan and have been since I was in sixth grade when I first discovered Tolkien. I read voraciously as a child, and I have a lot of other favorite authors, but in terms of fantasy, Tolkien was the one that inspired me. Then, of course, there was Terry Brooks and the Shannara series that also inspired me. And I always wanted to be able to do for young kids what they did for me while I was growing up.
You've written several series and a lot of books for young adults, some in the sci-fi and fantasy genres. What is it about writing for the young adult audience that draws you to it?
Because it's such an exciting audience. It's an audience that's so energetic and so excited about the world and so willing to take risks and explore things and discover new things. And they're also a very hard audience to write for the same reason. You have to be honest and truthful with this audience. You can't try and do the cloak and dagger stuff. You have to be upfront and honest about it. I had an experience a couple of years ago where I went to a high school and I talked about one of my books, Walls of Glass, which is about racism in the South. And it was really impressed upon me how interested these kids are in the real world and in finding the answers to real world problems like racism that they experience on a daily basis. And so I think writing for this audience is really challenging. The other thing I think is really challenging is that it's not just kids who read young adult fiction. Many of the people who review my book and contact me are adults. They're not kids at all. So I think that's another thing that's exciting about this audience is we're always kids. Even when we're 50 or 60, we can still remember what it was like to be in sixth grade or to be 18 and falling in love or being crushed by a broken relationship or something. We all remember this. And so I think that's what's so exciting about this genre is you're writing really to everyone.
You remember being a kid. There's a lot of people that do, and then there's a lot of people that don't, and that causes some problems. So do you think that your career as a professor has helped you understand that audience better?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I have the privilege of teaching to the perpetually young, right? I mean, my students never get older than 21. So, because they keep graduating and moving on and a new crop comes in. So, yeah, I think so. And it's interesting to watch as they change. So, for example, I just had a conversation this week with some of my students. I had mentioned a record player, and I thought, oh, they're not going to know what that is. And so I said, you guys all know what a record player is? And to my utter shock, everyone in that class raised their hand. And I was like, how do you know what a record player is? These things haven't existed. And I had students tell me, oh, I own a record player. I was like, really? I was utterly shocked by that. So these kids they're far more engaged, I think, than sometimes adults think. They're far more aware and they're far more accepting of diversity, I think, than a lot of older folks think they are.
James, do you model your characters after people you know, or are they strictly pure fiction?
It's a mix. So, for example, some of my characters, especially my female characters, in this book, Finola and Brigid, I kind of stole some characteristics from my two daughters. So I have daughters that are very strong women, and have always been strong women, but they have very different ways of being strong. So I tried to kind of pull that in. So the character Finola is roughly modeled on one of my daughters who had a very strong personality, who knew what she wanted out of life, was going to get it. And another one who also had a very strong personality, but it was a quieter determination as opposed to a more overt determination. So I kind of tried to mix that up because I was kind of writing these stories for them initially when I first started it. So it's a mix. And I think as an author, you're never able to really say a character is totally fictional because we're always drawing on our own experiences and our own interrelationship. So I think it's always a mix of, partly borrowing from people we know and then tweaking it a little bit.
Is Brian the main character in each book in your Archer of the Heathland series?
Most of them. Actually, it would be book 5 is Windermere. And in that one, I actually have Redmond, who is one of Brian's mentors. And the book is about him because I needed to go back and set up the rest of the series by showing what Redmond had gotten himself mixed up in on the mainland. So that one is actually a step back. The other one that's not fully about Brian is the book 4, which is called Chronicles. It's a mixture of 4 short stories and a novella that actually provide a lot of the background for the story and set up the last 2 books in the series. So I kind of took a pause in Brian's story to lay out a lot of the backstory that really needed to be in place for me to finish the last 2 volumes in the series.
In your bio, you say that you're a professional teller of stories, both real and imagined. Have you always seen yourself as an author?
I think I have probably wanted to be an author since I was again, since I first discovered literature when I was really around 6 or 7. But my mother read to me when I was a child too, and I always loved the stories. I always have had a fascination for the past as well. I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading or studying or play acting the past. And when we talk about history, history is really, when we write history, we mostly write in a narrative framework. It's a story. It happens to be a true story, at least it should be if it were being good historians. And fiction is just another way of telling stories about the human condition. And so I think, yeah, I've kind of always been a storyteller in that sense and always wanted to be a storyteller. I always wanted to be a historian. I mean, when I was in 5th grade and they used to ask us all the time, go around the room at the first day of class and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I was the weird kid who raised his hand and said, I want to be a historian. And everybody looked at me like I had 3 heads, so.
I can well imagine.
Yeah.
James, is there a moral of the story or a message in Deliverance that you would like your readers to remember?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if there's really an all-out, a full moral, but in terms of the message, one of the things I do hope young readers especially get from my work is that, life is about taking risks, and we can't always control what comes our way. And that doesn't mean we're responsible for bad things that happen to us. Bad things can happen without our being guilty of anything, and that we can still overcome. We can do hard things. We can face these challenges, and we can rise above them. I'm hoping that kids will be able to get that out of all of my stories.
Now I get to ask, will you please read a short excerpt from Deliverance for our listeners?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read something from the beginning. This is it's not right at the beginning, but it's just after it. Brian has been sent off by his father after having a kind of mysterious discussion with him to the fields. And then he hears his sister Bridget screaming. And now he's racing back towards their house. So that's where I'm going to start. Brian raced around the front of the cottage. His father lay prostrate in the trampled snow by the open door. A red pool stained the snow by his head. The jagged shaft of a broken arrow protruded from his shoulder. His sword lay clutched in his good hand. A crimson stain covered the tip. Waylon's fingers spasmed against the grip as if they struggled to raise it again. Brian stared for a moment in mute horror. Burning pain began to spread in his chest. He stooped. "Papa?" He shook Waylon's shoulder. "Papa!" Waylon groaned. Brian rolled him to his back. The sword slipped from Waylon's hand. He blinked slowly as if his eyelids were sticky with glue. Waylon opened his mouth and struggled to speak. "I told you," Waylon whispered. "I told you they would come." He blinked and tried to swallow. They didn't get it. Brian struggled to regain his internal balance. He had no idea what his father was talking about. He had heard Bridget scream. Where was she? "Keep it safe," Waylon said. "What?" Brian asked, unable to stifle the rising desperation. Waylon blinked and tried to wet his lips. "You're all they have now, Brian. Don't desert them." "I won't." "Take it." Waylon raised his withered hand. A large golden ring encircled his father's index finger. Brian stared at it. He had never seen it before. "Take it." Brian slipped the ringer off his father's hand. "Promise me," Waylon said. "Promise me you won't let them—" A long sigh escaped Waylon's lips, and he lay still. "No," Brian whispered. He laid a trembling hand on his father's chest, willing it to rise and fall, but his father never stirred. Brian saw the brutal wound in his father's head. It leaked blood and something gray into the thick brown hair. Tears slipped from Brian's eyes. He wiped savagely at them, terrified for his mother and Bridget. Where were they? Why hadn't they come? He lunged to his feet, shoving the ring into his pocket, and stepped back from his father's body. "Mama?" he called. "Bridget?" Silence greeted his words.
Oh my gosh. That's a cliffhanger stop for me. Definitely want us to learn more about that. So where can we learn more about you, about all your other books? And most of all, where can we purchase Archer of the Heathland, Deliverance?
So you can go to my website at jwelliot.com. And on the website, I have information about myself. I have all my books in the series are on there with links to every major online retailer where you can purchase them. And also, if you want to hear more about it or want to get a sample of what the story is like, you can go to the Intrigue. At the very bottom, there's a link there that will take you to an audiobook of Intrigue on my YouTube channel.
And there is links to purchase for all of your books on your website. And I believe there's also a place where we can sign up for a newsletter. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. When you first come on, there's a pop-up and you can sign up and you'll be signed for my newsletter. And you'll also get a free short story when you sign up.
We've been talking with J.W. Elliot, author of Archer of the Heathland, Deliverance. James, thank you so much for sharing Deliverance with us today. I'm sure a lot of our audience will want to begin reading your Archer of the Heathland series, and I do hope that you'll want to come back and chat with us again when you publish your next book.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be with you. I appreciate it.
Here's a review for Deliverance. Mr. Elliot has written an enjoyable story that entices me to read the next one. The characters work together nicely while keeping the character of their time with some of our more modern attitudes for today's readers. I enjoyed it a lot. So if you really want to learn more, if you love that excerpt as I did, then go to jwelliot.com, order your copy today, and when you finish, don't forget to post your review. And please share this interview with your friends so that they too may become acquainted with their author. And remember, the Author Show may be accessed at any time at theauthorshow.com. Plus, selected interviews can be found on major platforms such as Amazon Fire TV, the Roku channel, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and many more. Whether you're an author who would like to be featured or a reader in search of new books, theauthorshow.com is a really great place to start.
Thanks for listening to The Author Show. Find out more about authors and their work at theauthorshow.com. Theauthorshow.com. Tune in next time to another great author on The Author Show.